Imagine a place so desolate and terrifying that the very mention of its name sent shivers down the spines of hardened criminals across France. This was not merely a prison, but a kingdom of suffering located thousands of miles away from civilization in the shark-infested waters of French Guiana. It was known as the Green Hell, or simply the Bagni. Within this tropical nightmare lay the most secure and feared location of all, which was Devil's Island. For nearly a century, this rocky outcrop served as the final destination for political prisoners and the most dangerous convicts the French judicial system could produce. The ocean currents surrounding the island were deadly, and the waters teemed with sharks that were fed regularly by the guards to discourage any thoughts of swimming to freedom. Escaping this place was considered a statistical impossibility. Among the thousands of wretched souls condemned to rot in this tropical purgatory was a young man named Henri Charriere. He was a charismatic and tough individual from the Ardèche region of France who had found his way into the Parisian underworld. He was known to his friends and enemies alike by a singular nickname derived from the tattoo on his chest. That nickname was Papillon, which is the French word for butterfly. This butterfly would become a symbol of an indomitable spirit that refused to be crushed by stone walls or iron bars. Henri Charriere was not just another number in the penal register. He was a man possessed by a singular and burning obsession to regain his freedom at any cost. His story is one of the most controversial and compelling tales of human endurance ever recorded. The journey to the penal colony began in the seedier districts of Paris during the early 1930s. It was a time of jazz and shadowy dealings in the Montmartre district, where gangsters and hustlers vied for control. Henri Charriere was a safecracker and a respected figure in this illicit world. However, his life took a catastrophic turn when a pimp and police informant named Roland Lepeti was found shot in the stomach. The police were under immense pressure to solve the crime and clean up the streets. Despite his vehement protestations of innocence and a lack of hard physical evidence linking him directly to the weapon, Charriere was targeted by the investigation. The police relied heavily on the testimony of informants who were likely saving their own skins. The trial was a swift and brutal affair that highlighted the unforgiving nature of the French justice system at the time. The prosecutor painted Charriere as a dangerous menace to society who deserved no mercy. The jury was swayed by the character assassination rather than concrete proof of the murder. On October 26, 1930, one Henri Charriere was found guilty of murder. The sentence was hard labor for life in the penal colonies of French Guiana. At that moment, his life as a free man in Paris ended, and his existence as a convict began. He was stripped of his civil rights, and his personal identity was replaced by a registration number. He vowed then and there that he would not die in prison clothes. The transportation of convicts to South America was a nightmare in itself. Charriere was loaded onto the La Martiniere, which was a purpose-built cage ship designed to ferry prisoners across the Atlantic Ocean. The men were packed into large metal cages below deck, where the heat was stifling, and the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. For weeks, they endured rough seas and brutal discipline from the guards. Any sign of rebellion was met with high-pressure steam hoses that could scald a man's skin from his bones. It was during this hellish voyage that Charriere began to assess his fellow inmates, looking for those who had the strength and the courage to join him in an escape attempt. The ship eventually anchored in the muddy estuary of the Maroni River. The prisoners were offloaded at Saint-Laurent-du-Maroni, which served as the administrative capital of the penal colony. The first thing that hit them was the oppressive humidity and the overwhelming heat of the jungle. They were gathered in a central courtyard, to hear the welcome speech from the camp commandant. The speech was infamous for its chilling simplicity. The commandant told them that France had rejected them and that they now belonged to the penal administration. He warned them that the jungle was a green grave and that attempting to escape was a futile act of suicide. This speech was designed to break their spirits immediately. Life in the penal colony was a daily struggle for survival against disease and brutality. Malaria and dysentery were rampant, and the medical treatment was rudimentary at best. The prisoners were forced to work long hours in the jungle, felling massive trees and clearing swamps. The guards were often sadistic, and the hierarchy among the prisoners was ruled by the knife. Charriere navigated this dangerous world with caution. He knew that one wrong move could result in a fatal stabbing or a sentence to the solitary confinement block. He kept his head down while constantly observing the routines of the guards and the layout of the camp. He was not interested in becoming a boss of the prison yard. He only wanted out. Charriere knew that the longer he stayed in St. Laurent, the weaker he would become. The climate aged men rapidly, and the hard labor sapped their strength. He decided that he had to escape quickly before the system broke him completely. He began to make connections with other convicts who had access to resources. He needed a boat and supplies to navigate the treacherous coast. He managed to secure a small amount of money that had been smuggled inside a plan, which was a small aluminum tube hidden in the rectum. This money was his lifeline. It would buy the loyalty of corrupt guards or the silence of fellow inmates. The plan began to take shape within weeks of his arrival. The first escape attempt was a desperate gamble that took place only 42 days after his arrival. Charriere, along with two other convicts named Henri Charriere and Jones Clausiat, managed to slip away from a work detail. They acquired a small and leaky boat from a local contact. Their goal was to sail northwest along the coast toward Colombia, which did not have an extradition treaty with France. The journey was fraught with peril as they navigated through shark-infested waters and battled violent storms. They were constantly bailing water and rationing their meager supplies. It was a test of endurance that pushed them to their absolute physical limits. During this initial flight, they encountered a colony of lepers on an island near the coast. In a surprising twist of fate, these outcasts provided the fugitives with a better boat and supplies. The lepers, who were shunned by the rest of the world, recognized a shared suffering in the escaped convicts. This act of kindness allowed Charriere and his companions to continue their journey. They eventually reached the Guajira Peninsula in Colombia. However, their freedom was short-lived. They were captured by Colombian authorities and thrown into a local prison. But Charriere was not done. He managed to escape that prison as well and fled into the territory of the Guajira Indians. For several months, Charriere lived among the native tribe in a coastal village. It was a paradise compared to the hell of the penal colony. He was accepted by the people and even took 2 wives according to his memoirs. He hunted and fished and lived a life of simple freedom. But the pull of the outside world and the desire to truly be free in a modern society gnawed at him. He made the fateful decision to leave the tribe and head toward the city. This proved to be a disastrous mistake. He was recaptured by Colombian police, who this time ensured he was handed back to the French authorities in accordance with international agreements. The return to French Guiana was a crushing blow. The punishment for escape was severe. Charriere was sentenced to 2 years in solitary confinement on St. Joseph Island. This place was known as the Man-Eater. The cells were small stone pits with a grill on the ceiling instead of a solid roof, allowing the guards to walk above and observe the prisoners at all times. Absolute silence was enforced. Speaking to another prisoner was punishable by a reduction in rations or a beating. The isolation was designed to drive men insane. Many prisoners lost their minds within months, screaming into the darkness until they were dragged away to the asylum. Charriere survived solitary confinement through sheer mental fortitude. He paced his cell for hours every day, walking back and forth to keep his muscles from atrophying. He played mental games, recounting every detail of his life in Paris and imagining elaborate future scenarios. He refused to let the silence break him. He learned to communicate with other prisoners, using tapping codes on the stone walls. They shared news and encouraged each other to hold on. The darkness of the cell became a canvas for his imagination. He visualized the ocean and the butterfly tattoo on his chest, reminding him that he was meant to fly free. When Charriere was finally released from solitary confinement, he was a changed man. He was thinner and older, but his resolve was harder than diamond. He was transferred to Real Island, which was the administrative center of the 3 Salvation Islands. The conditions here were slightly better than solitary, but escape was considered even more difficult than from the mainland. The islands were surrounded by strong currents, and the guards were vigilant. Yet Charriere immediately began plotting again. He spent his time studying the movement of the tides and the habits of the sharks that circled the islands, waiting for the daily disposal of refuse from the slaughterhouse. The Salvation Islands group consisted of 3 islands. Real Island was for the general population and administration. St. Joseph Island was for solitary confinement and punishment. And then there was Devil's Island. This smallest island was reserved for political prisoners and those considered the most dangerous or high profile. It was a rocky plateau surrounded by crashing waves and treacherous reefs. A cable car system connected it to Real Island because boats could rarely dock safely. It was the most isolated place on Earth. Charriere knew that if he was ever sent there, his chances of escape would drop to near zero. Devil's Island had gained worldwide infamy decades earlier as the prison of Alfred Dreyfus, the French artillery officer falsely accused of treason. The world saw it as a symbol of injustice and cruelty. For the convicts of the 1940s, it was a place of no return. The currents around the island were chaotic, creating a natural barrier that no swimmer could cross. The sharks were numerous and aggressive. The prisoners lived in small huts and were allowed some freedom of movement on the island itself, but they were completely cut off from the rest of the world. It was a gilded cage made of palm trees and ocean spray. Eventually, Charriere found himself transferred to Devil's Island. Most men would have given up hope at this point, but Charriere saw it as a challenge. He spent his days sitting on a rocky bench, overlooking the ocean, watching the waves crash against the cliffs. He observed the patterns of the water with the eye of a scientist. He noticed that the waves came in sets. There was a rhythm to the chaos. He realized that every 7th wave was larger than the others and created a massive surge that cleared the reef and pushed out to the open sea. This observation became the cornerstone of his final escape plan. He theorized that if he could jump into the water at the exact moment the 7th wave hit, he would be carried over the sharp rocks and out into the deeper current. It was a theory based on simple physics and desperate hope. He needed a flotation device that could withstand the impact and keep him afloat for days. He could not build a boat as there were no tools or wood available. He had to improvise using the only natural resource that was abundant on the island, which was coconuts. Charriere discovered that sacks filled with coconuts were incredibly buoyant. They were natural life preservers that would not sink even if they were battered by the waves. He began to secretly collect large burlap sacks. He and a fellow prisoner named Sylvain decided to brave the ocean together. Sylvain was a younger convict who looked up to Charriere. They formed a pact to either succeed together or die together in the attempt. They spent weeks gathering coconuts and hiding them in a cave near the cliffs, waiting for the perfect tide and weather conditions. The preparation was meticulous. They tested the buoyancy of the sacks in tidal pools to ensure they could support the weight of a grown man. They lashed the sacks together with vines to create 2 crude rafts. Each raft consisted of 2 sacks joined together, allowing the escapee to sit in the middle. It was a primitive design, but it was their only hope. They waited for a day when the sea was rough enough to provide the 7th wave surge, but not so violent that it would smash them against the cliffs immediately. The tension was palpable as they watched the horizon. The day of the escape arrived. Charriere and Sylvain dragged their heavy coconut sacks to the edge of the cliff. The drop to the water was steep, and jagged rocks protruded from the surf below. They watched the sets of waves, counting them out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then came the 7th wave, a towering wall of water that crashed with a deafening roar. Charriere yelled the signal, and they threw their sacks into the foam and leaped after them. It was a leap of faith into the unknown. The water engulfed them, and the force of the wave tumbled them like rag dolls. Miraculously, the plan worked. The surge of the 7th wave caught them and propelled them over the deadly reef. They paddled frantically with their hands and feet fighting to get away from the suction of the island. They climbed onto their coconut rafts and began the grueling task of drifting toward the mainland. They were now at the mercy of the ocean currents. The sharks were a constant threat. Charriere recounts feeling the rough skin of sharks brushing against his legs as they dangled in the water. They had to remain perfectly still to avoid triggering a feeding frenzy. The journey on the coconut rafts was a slow and agonizing ordeal. For days and nights, they drifted under the scorching equatorial sun. Their skin blistered and peeled. Their lips cracked from dehydration. They had no fresh water and no food. They were delirious with thirst and exhaustion. The ocean, which had been their road to freedom, now threatened to become their grave. They drifted apart at times, only to be brought back together by the whimsical currents. They encouraged each other to keep moving their legs to prevent cramps and to stay alert. Tragedy struck as they neared the coast of the mainland. The currents became treacherous as the ocean met the muddy waters of the rivers. Sylvain, unable to withstand the exhaustion, or perhaps misjudging the safety of the shore, abandoned his raft too early. He attempted to swim through a patch of quicksand or mud flats. Charriere watched in horror as his companion was swallowed by the earth or the sea. It is a point of contention in the historical record, but in the narrative of his life, this loss was a devastating blow. Charriere was now alone again, drifting toward an uncertain fate. Charriere eventually washed ashore on the coast of British Guiana. He was half-dead, starved, and exhausted beyond measure. He had accomplished the impossible. He had escaped from Devil's Island. But his journey was not over. He was still a fugitive. He managed to cross the border into Venezuela, where the political climate was different. The Venezuelan authorities did not have the same rigid extradition agreements with France regarding escaped convicts. They saw him not as a murderer, but as a survivor of a cruel and inhumane system. In Venezuela, Charriere was finally able to breathe the air of freedom. He was initially detained and monitored, but he was not sent back to the green hell. He worked hard to integrate himself into Venezuelan society. He took on various jobs, utilizing the street smarts and charm that had served him in Paris. He eventually gained citizenship and married a Venezuelan woman. The butterfly had finally found a place to land. He lived a life that was respectable and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of his youth and the brutality of his imprisonment. Decades later, Henri Charriere decided to tell his story. He wrote a manuscript detailing his adventures, his suffering, and his ultimate triumph. The book, titled Papillon, was published in France in 1969. It became an instant literary sensation. It sold millions of copies and was translated into dozens of languages. The world was captivated by the tale of the man who refused to be broken. It shone a harsh spotlight on the French penal system, which had already been closed down, but remained a stain on the national conscience. With fame came scrutiny. Journalists and historians began to investigate the claims made in the book. They found discrepancies in dates and events. Some claimed that Charriere had appropriated the stories of other inmates and woven them into his own narrative. Critics argued that no single man could have survived all the adventures he described. They suggested that Papillon was a composite character, a representation of the collective suffering of all the prisoners, rather than a strictly factual autobiography. Charriere, however, maintained, until his death, that the core of the story was true. Regardless of the debate over its absolute factual accuracy, the story of Papillon had a profound impact on the world. It exposed the cruelty of the Bagny system to a global audience. The penal colonies of French Guiana were officially closed in 1953, but the ruins still stand today. The jungle is slowly reclaiming the stone cells and the rusted bars. Tourists now visit the islands to see the remains of the nightmare. They walk the same paths where Charriere paced and look out at the same ocean that he conquered. Henri Charriere died in 1973, a free man. His legacy is not defined by the crime he was accused of, but by his relentless pursuit of liberty. The image of the butterfly tattoo has become a universal symbol of hope and resilience. His story reminds us that the human spirit is capable of enduring unimaginable hardships. Whether every detail of his escape was precise fact or embellished legend matters less than the truth of his resistance. He proved that even in the darkest of places, on the most isolated rock in the ocean, a man can still dream of freedom and make that dream a reality.